Right in.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. We are back with our final installment in our series of conversations on the US elections, because those elections were last Tuesday. So technically, we are no longer in elections territory, but we are now in a position where we can look back on the election campaign and we can look back on 4 years of the Trump presidency. And we're going to be doing that without my colleague Dario, who will not be joining us for today's conversation. But we'll be doing this with the academic director of the RIAS, Professor Giles Scott Smith. Hi, Giles.
Hello there, everybody. Hi, Cees.
So, Giles, I just want to dive in straight away. You've been at the RIAS. Well, the RIAS has existed in its current form for about 4 years now, and has as such almost the first 4 years of its existence and your time as director there have kind of overlapped almost entirely with the Trump presidency, which is an interesting time to be starting off as a research institute on American studies and American history.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, I hadn't realised until you said that indeed the RIAS started officially in January 2017 when Trump came into the White House. So yeah, looking back, last 4 years, a lot of curiosity about whether Trump would generate more interest in American studies or less. I mean, we've seen this in the past, the Bush push, early 2000s, and how 9/11, post 9/11 and the Iraq War generated a great deal of interest in American studies, and that particular generation of students really wanting to understand what was going on with US politics and US foreign policy in particular. My sense, Cees, is that has not happened with Trump, that we're in a different generation now. That sure, everyone is still very interested in populism and its effect on the body politic, but there does seem to be also a bit of a turning away, and I don't think American studies has really benefited from the Trump years in that sense.
And why do you think? I mean, because you have, of course, made something of a study of the subject of American studies as an academic discipline, right? The way that it comes into European universities in its kind of context of the Cold War. So you're able to sort of speak on this with some sense of historical background. Like, why do you have a sense of why? Do you have a sense of why that is? Why Trump has not generated the same kind of interest in American studies in the way that the Bush years have?
I think it's a very good question, but I do think it has something to do with the sense that the US no longer represents the the kind of the topic of study of interest that it once did. I think there were still things to explore in US history and society 20 years ago, which now are just not seen as being as that appealing anymore. To the generation of students coming in now, there is a sense that they don't want to. They're interested in looking elsewhere, and I say this from being involved in international studies in Leiden, where students have to choose their region of study, right, and they choose wherever they want: Latin America, East Asia, you name it. And North America has been declining over the last 3-4 years, consistently. So that says something, that there is just a general, at least amongst our students, a general kind of turning away.
Yeah, I mean, we can I suppose speculate on why that might be the case. I mean, it would be interesting to ask some of those students why why sort of the United States or North America is not quite as popular. Is it a case of oversaturation? I think like these conversations we've been having here in this space have been, in a sense, all about Trump. Is he, in a sense, become sort of, has that side of the United States just become so overfamiliar that students want to study something they maybe haven't explored quite as much?
Yeah, I think that's a very wise comment. I think Trump has just been so larger than life. And of course, that's his whole strategy, to be larger than life, that he blots out a lot of what is still very interesting and valuable about the United States in particular. So, yeah, I think that's very true.
Because that's been a part of these conversations that we've been having, right? The sense of how do you write the history? How do you understand the history of the United States when the end point of that history is the Trump presidency? And of course, the story that you're telling about what the United States is, sort of what sort of political forces emerge out of it, that's a very different story if that story leads up to Obama and the election of the first black president than if it ends up with Trump. I mean, is that something that you've noticed? Like, has your understanding of American history changed at all during the last 4 years? Is that something that you've noticed? Are there things that you have learned about the United States that you might not otherwise have had?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I think it tells us how mistaken it is to focus history of the US on the presidency. That definitely Obama represented a very significant moment in US politics, but the undercurrents of opposition, the conservative backlash that were really building from Clinton onwards, that they were, a running stream of discontent leading up to 2016, and really telling us that, yeah, it's if you're not aware of that, you can really have a totally fundamentally mistaken view of U.S. political history. I mean, I still think Obama was a very important moment, but it wasn't it was a moment. It wasn't the turning point that the kind of the weak history, the progressive history of the United States hoped it was.
Yeah. Although, of course, sort of just thinking back on the last year or so, right? I think the last year has made very clear that you can't just in sort of seeing the sort of reactions that we've been seeing in the Netherlands among students as well to the Black Lives Matter movement. I think it's made very clear that the United States remains this kind of very wide. It contains, in one sense, a much wider and diverse sense of opinions that have come forward about the United States. Like, in a sense, studying the United States in the Cold War was, in one sense, an easier proposition because the Cold War kind of defined the boundaries of what the United States was, right? And the success of things that we've seen since, I mean, you could still maintain that in the Clinton years, but from Bush onwards, it's become so evident with the ongoing process of polarization that the United States does contain such an immense diversity of opinions. Here on this podcast, we've spoken to a number of American colleagues who are very interested in some of the ideas and movements that are emerging on the left flank of the Democratic Party. I mean, these are ideas that would not have necessarily have acquired the space that they had during the Clinton years, right? When it was still kind of quite clear kind of what both of these parties stood for. And the polarization of the political landscape and new media have kind of given us a broader, maybe more interesting, but also much more diffuse idea of what the United States is.
Yeah, and more divided. I mean, I think that's no question about it. It's fragmented. I think really, though, if you look back on the history of social movements through the US, there's always been more diversity and variety than meets the immediate eye. Certainly, I mean, in the US, certainly from 60s onwards, and even if you think about how the US, there was a great political battle over how the US would position itself in the Cold War from the 70s onwards. The détente crowd really going up against the group who would basically become the neocons. So I think there have been those big divisions, but I think the level of rejection of alternative viewpoints now is really something that we haven't seen. We've seen it on the extremes, but now the extreme has really moved towards the center, and I think that's the biggest thing about the Trump years that I think is most damaging. That it's opened the door for very extreme views into the heart of American politics.
Yeah, and it's normalized certain views that would that other different circumstances would not have considered.
Absolutely.
And it has, if we consider kind of how, the original part of the original idea of American studies was that it would sort of familiarizing foreign and especially European publics with the United States would engender this kind of sympathy within a Cold War context. I'm not sure that same proposition applies anymore, right?
Indeed, I think, in the Cold War, you could really say that American studies had an important role within the wider kind of idea of generating support and understanding for U.S. foreign policy, say. If you understood America and American people and where it came from, what its ideals were, then you would have a bit more sympathy for what it stood for and why it was doing what it was doing in the Cold War. And I think it's true that, they used to say, what was it, Ackerson, who said about Britain that it lost an empire and was searching for a role in about 60, 61. And you can say the US, it won the Cold War, but it lost it at the same time as a kind of guiding framework for foreign policy. And it's been a constant battle since then about what it should do. It was democracy promotion for a while, humanitarian intervention, that crumbled basically in the early 2010s, and Obama had the shift to the Pacific, saying, okay, we're going to focus on China, but it was unclear what that really meant. And then you get Trump, who says, everything is irrelevant unless there's an obvious immediate material benefit for the US. So, again, a very kind of fragmented attempt to kind of chart a path into the 21st century.
Yeah. And I suppose that is one of the central questions one of the central questions of the Trump era that in some way, shape or form, historians have been asking themselves over and over again, like, to what extent does Trump represent this kind of radical break with the past, or to what extent can we interpret his presidency as an iteration of some of these trends that have been going on for much longer? Yeah. And certainly in the realm of foreign policy, like in one sense, some of the things that he has called on about the question, like called the value of America's alliance systems into question. There were rumors at one point that he wanted to pull out of NATO, and certainly sort of questioned sort of the value of this kind of multilateral system that the United States did so much to construct. But then again, in a longer term, it is this part of what you say, looking for a role in a Cold War, in a post-Cold War world. Yeah.
I think if we'd had a second Trump term, NATO would have been in serious danger. I think a second Trump term would have been probably no holds barred attack against various remaining pillars of US liberal internationalism, of which NATO would be quite central.
Because that is in a sense the curious thing of the Trump presidency, kind of seen from a foreign relations perspective. I mean, there have been certainly, one of the key warnings that was sounded about a Trump presidency was that he would essentially take a sledgehammer to the liberal international order, whatever you understand under that phrase. And I mean, from where I'm, and I may be wrong on this, but with the significant exception of, I think, really the delaying American adherence to the Paris Climate Agreement for 4 years really has the potential to do some real damage to the way that climate change gets addressed internationally.
Yeah.
But apart from that, like, there has been quite a lot of bluster in the foreign policy sphere. We remember the North Korea summit, the assassination of Soleimani, which might have gone somewhere it might have gone in an interesting direction if not for the COVID pandemic. But really, has it been as bad as predicted that it would be in your assessment?
Yeah, I think it has, because I think the results you don't immediately see. I mean, you can point to not just Paris, but the withdrawal from the nuclear agreement with Iran, which I think was a major step away from kind of classic US-led multilateralism. The one-on-ones with North Korea is all fine, but it hasn't realized anything. And at the same time, that's Trump walking away from the six-party talks, which were trying to move North Korea down towards a path of normalization. And then you had the complete pullout from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership is complete in the freezer. So, and I can go on. The deliberate undermining of World Trade Organization dispute settlement boards because the US are not appointing judges. So there's an awful lot going on where it's inaction. It's not taking a sledgehammer. It's just not acting. And as we know, if you want to maintain any kind of international system and a normative system in particular, you've got to invest in it all the time. And if the US walks away, that has an impact.
I mean, that's in a sense is one of the criticisms that have been. I mean, Emmanuel Macron phrased this in quite stark terms when he accused NATO of being brain dead.
Yeah.
And there has been a sense, I think, in many sort of capitals in Europe, certainly, that the international system has to some degree been running on fumes during the last 4 years, because everyone was kind of holding their breath around what a President Trump might do and sort of baiting their breath for when he might be out of office.
Yeah.
I wonder, we had the I mean, you study in a sense, you've studied in a sense the networks and the fabrics that made up that kind of American embedding in the global order during the Cold War, right? You've studied scholarships, you've studied student exchanges, the Fulbright program, as well as some other sort of forms of Cold War networks. So those are sort of the kind of exchanges that don't often attract a lot of attention because they happen kind of below the surface of day-to-day politics, which in a sense has been sometimes sort of given as the strength of these kind of exchanges, right? That they are in a sense at several degrees removed from politics. Do you have the sense that, have those kind of exchanges, to the extent that they still survive in the post-Cold War era, have those kind of survived the post-Trump era intact, or?
They have, and it's fair to say that there is still a good lobby in Washington, including in Congress, that looks out for those forms of cultural diplomacy, because there's a general understanding that it's just in the US interest. But in the first year or two of the Trump administration, there was definitely an attempt to completely destroy that entire budget. The fact that did not happen does demonstrate that there is still political pushback in their favor. And I think, broadly speaking, in various fields of, say, knowledge production, the US is still absolutely number one. I mean, you can't knock the Ivy League, the influence of US think tanks like Brookings, CSIS, etc. Very, very powerful. And the whole kind of link up with certain sectors of the US economy, such as Silicon Valley, I think are still, paramount in a global setting. Having said that, that position is being caught up. I mean, it was very interesting over the last 10 years or so how China deliberately started to invest in building up its own think tank capacity. So moving away from simple kind of Confucius Institute cultural diplomacy towards literally starting to concentrate on the infrastructure of, okay, let's start telling the world what our vision of world order actually is. That's a whole bigger thing. And I think that's just going to increase over the next decade or so. So what I'm basically saying is the kind of infrastructure of US soft power, if you like, is still to a degree in place. It is not really being invested in to any greater extent. And the relative position of the US in that sense is then declining in a global sense.
And there's a question to what extent, I mean, this is something that I'm quite actively wondering, is to what extent that infrastructure still represents American soft power in an age when those same universities and some of those same tech companies sort of become kind of an active target of opposition from the governing party. These are not institutions that are pulling in the same direction necessarily. And to a larger, and then it's a separate question for whether an institution like Facebook, right, or Amazon can be conceived as an instrument of American power, right?
Yeah.
Because these are not state companies or state-directed companies in the way that Huawei or some of these kind of Chinese institutions that you mentioned are talking about.
No, I think that's a very good point, and certainly the way the tech companies first were bashed for being monopolies and having to face committees in Congress for being completely unregulated, and therefore allowing the Russians allegedly to undermine US elections, and now they're being bashed for actually stepping into a regulatory role to try and fight back against fake news. So their position is indefensible, whatever they do or don't do, which is quite funny. But I think you're right that those corporations, are they particularly interested? It is that divide between kind of corporate power and US national interest. To what extent are these big corporations, and you can say this throughout the 20th century really, do they always work in US national interest? No, they don't. They are there to generate profit, and if that means moving facilities out of the US itself, cutting jobs, then they do, and they will, and they always will. So I don't think that divide is particularly new. I think the power over information and communication, though, is on a scale we've never seen before. That's true.
Yeah, and I suppose in one sense it might be just about possible to imagine a scenario in which on issues like AI, machine learning, right? If these companies are then facing Chinese or European technology giants which are aligned with their respective governments, this is certainly the case in China, and there's noises within the European to go into a similar direction, you might then see a scenario in which you might get a combination of sort of governmental support for these kind of institutions, but it's not something that's been materializing so far, at least not as far as I can see.
No, it depends what you mean by government support, of course. There's obviously been a lot of collusion with the National Security Agency, and as we well know, thanks to Edward Snowden. So you could say that they active part of the US security landscape. But the US has started to think of the idea of national champions and preventing investments in key industries. I mean, that already started before Trump, of course. So that's been something that's going on over the last 10, 15 years or so.
Which brings us, in a sense, like to the next kind of natural question is what we might have to look forward to for the next 4 years of a Biden or a Biden-Harris presidency. Because this issue of technology, how to manage tech firms' impact on American and global democracy is something that the Biden campaign has kind of has put kind of at the front and center of some of its commitments on American foreign policy. I think at one point even they explicitly call out that they want to limit the extent to which U.S. Technology companies are able to sell surveillance technology to China. Right?
Yeah.
There's a sense of these being some of the real kind of battlegrounds in how. Do you like this phrase "New Cold War"? Is that something that you subscribe to, or do you think it's a flawed historical metaphor to use that to the U.S.-China relationship?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it does fit. It partly fits, of course. I mean, the classic Cold War was the capitalism versus communism, and China is a different kind of beast. So it's somewhere in between kind of revival of Cold War dynamics plus simple great power contest.
Yeah.
But I think there is a growing sense of what a I think one important difference is how China, to what extent does China proselytize a certain model of governance and actively work towards taking down alternatives? Well, yeah, it does actively work towards taking down alternatives if they're pro-US. There's no doubt about that. The China's attitude is very much orientated towards Chinese political stability and economic growth. And if there's any kind of system that may be in the way of that, then they do look to maneuver and undermine it.
That's not the same thing, though, as a globalized, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's just not a simple kind of placing the Cold War framework onto the 21st century. No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Because the point is, does China try and export a single party mixed economy model to other countries? And no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. It doesn't really care what other countries do as long as they fit in with the broader kind of Chinese interests on, say, South China Sea or Xinjiang or whatever.
Yeah.
That's a big difference.
I suppose one of the ways in which the Cold War metaphor does matter is exactly in the way that we spoke about earlier, the way that the Cold War sort of features in American historical memory as, the great big fight that they won. And if this sort of question of looking for a purpose in in this kind of post-Cold War era, then going back into what seems like a new kind of Cold War era might be, in one sense, quite a comforting fallback position for people, including Biden, who lived through the latter years of that period in history.
Yeah, no, it's a very simple framework. It tells you who the enemy is and where you've got to put your resources. And I think that's very shrewd thinking. If you think the US came out of the Cold War with a gigantic military establishment, which demonstrated its prowess then in the Gulf War in '91, and then under Clinton there was a bit of a peace dividend. Of course, there were major cutbacks on nuclear weapons with the Russians, and a sense that maybe the US didn't need such a vast military establishment, but they found other roles for it. Certainly Bush did, and the Cold War kind of explains it again. They say, that's why we need to invest in this this incredible infrastructure. So yeah, it is very comforting then, I think.
Yeah. Although of course we have to, I suppose, bear in mind that the Cold War. The Cold War is a very different history once you start writing it from Asia outward instead of Europe.
Right.
1989 in Europe is the fall of the Berlin Wall. In China, it's Tiananmen Square, and the triumph in one sense of one aspect of the, for lack of a better phrase, the Western model, namely the economic one. But it's fairly permanent detachment in '89 from the democratic governance bit of it, and it's looking out from Beijing. It's not at all quite so clear that the United States really did want the Cold War, or whether the Cold War that China experienced is even over.
Yeah, true. If you can somehow insert Taiwan into kind of Chinese version of the Cold War, which to an extent you could, then it's still very much ongoing.
Right, because those borders are still frozen, right? There's still a North Korea, there's still a Taiwan.
Yeah, Korea is still divided on China's doorstep, very much there. And if you look further to Japan and Russia, I mean, the Russian occupation of those islands to the north of Japan, also going back to World War II, still unresolved. Yeah. So yeah, no, there's still a lot of fault lines there. That's true.
Mm-hmm. What else do you expect of a Biden? Do you have any expectations of what a Biden presidency might look like? I'm asking, of course, a historian to make predictions, which I realize is a very hazardous thing to ever do. But
well, the only prediction I'll make is that it'll be a one-term presidency. I can't imagine him going for 2 terms. Maybe he would like to, but I just feel that he would be 81, and I can't really see that being a workable prospect. So I think I mean, we all know about the battle over the Senate. The 2 Georgian runoffs in January are huge. I can't imagine the Democrats will win both of them. I would love them to, but I dare say it would probably just be one. So it's going to be a case of whether the Biden magic in Congress can still work. It didn't work so well under Obama in that second term, and Mitch McConnell is still around, and the debate is far more heated now. So it could be that we're hoping for too much there. I think Biden presidency is really a holding operation, and it's really 24 candidates stood for the Democratic nomination. 24. The hope is, of course, that under Biden 4 years, that there is at least some gathering of momentum behind a core within the Democratic Party. Kamala Harris, of course, is in the front seat there, but she can't do it on her own. And I think that is really my hope, that the fragmentation on the center left in America, that Biden at least helps towards gathering it around a set of core values, knowing that 2024 is just going to be an absolute shitstorm of an election. God knows if it's going to be Ivanka with Trump financing.
I dare not make any predictions about the Republican Party in 4 years.
That's the point. That is the point, Cees. Every single option is on the table now. We are looking at half of the U.S. political party system is utterly bankrupt, completely sold its soul to whatever it thinks will get it elected, and I dread to think which way it's going to go for the next election cycle. I mean, so I think that's really the challenge for Biden.
Yeah, and of course Biden has traditionally represented himself as, I mean, this is not something that he might have had his political career started out a different way, right? Of course, his entire political life has in one sense been marred with tragedy, with his most of his family dying in a car accident shortly after he became a senator. And this sense of healing, of making connections with people is in many ways at the core of who Biden is as a politician. In that sense, if this is a labor that is at all doable, right, to bring these divided sides, or at least I don't think bringing the two extremes back together is a reasonable proposition, but to reconstruct something like an American center, in somewhat in I suppose in the right-leaning corner of the Democratic Party, seems like something that Biden might be able to do here. Of course, there's a lot of questions that surround, like, what will he be able to do with a Senate where he doesn't have the majority. I mean, we'll be seeing sort of what defines his governing style over the coming.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you're going to be, beside the elections in Georgia, is there something that you're going to be looking out for as you're watching this new administration come in?
Well, to go back to one topic we covered, and we didn't really cover in complete detail, but the State Department, and the fact that Trump left a lot of posts empty. He wasn't interested in diplomacy, and there was basically an active policy amongst the Trump in crowd to undermine American diplomacy from within. And what I would hope is that under Biden there is a revival. That the presence of U.S. diplomacy around the globe is revived with the kind of quality people who deserve to be in the right positions. I very much hope that is the case. Again, comes down to the Senate, so it's a bit of a lottery, but I think that's certainly what I will be keeping an eye on.
Yeah. Of course, I did read through the Biden's foreign policy platform for this election, which makes interesting reading, by the way, because a lot of it is not about foreign policy at all, or at least not overtly so. The first few paragraphs are really devoted to rebuilding the image of American democracy abroad, which sort of ties into income inequality in education and addressing issues of racial justice. It's about, he prioritizes a strong economy before really, of course, this is election literature, so, it kind of makes sense for him to prioritize these things. But it does, I think, an interesting point over what the sort of things are that he's going to be prioritizing. The issue of restoring democracy restoration, which he really seems to have put at the center of his domestic campaign, also has some relevance for foreign policy. Like, he mentions at one point, for instance, the idea of holding NATO members to account for those who are perceived to be backsliding on democratic norms. So, I mean, that's that I'll be watching out for, is how exactly this new administration is going to be treating allies like Turkey, for instance, NATO members who during the last 4 years have increasingly been diverging from what you might expect the United States wants from that alliance.
Yeah, that's a very good point, a more principled approach. And also I think Brexit is very interesting because, of course, the wish of the Johnson government to strike some kind of trade deal was very much hampered by the position under Trump to kind of have everything under some kind of free trade, no protection deal. Mm-hmm. And Biden is really, he was really in the Obama camp that Brexit was an all-round bad idea. So Johnson could be going from out of the frying pan into the fire, really. I don't know. I'd be very interested to check out the so-called special relationship.
It's a reflection, I think, to what extent, and the UK is an extreme case, but I think this to a certain extent also applies to other European countries, including the Netherlands, like how much of our domestic politics has become entwined with the American culture wars.
Yeah.
Where Brexit, as pursued by some of its people, not least of which Boris Johnson, was fairly explicitly aligned with the Trump project as well.
Yeah.
And then that's all well and good, but how then to kind of redefine that as bipartisan national policy when the other side wins is.
Yeah. I mean, I think, we'll have to see. I mean, Johnson Trump was not a marriage made in heaven. I mean, that's the interesting thing about Trump. Everyone assumes that he was in favor of so-called strongmen around the world, but no, he was often clashing with them quite regularly because he just wants to be top dog. But I mean, Britain is sadly entering almost certainly a hard Brexit unless they pull a rabbit out of the hat in the next 6 weeks, which means it's going to fall into a totally different position under WTO trade rules and scrambling around. I mean, they're going to be scrambling around for signing deals now that they have no longer any, assuming no EU baggage.
Mm-hmm.
But what's Biden gonna do on that? Yeah.
And there have already been, the key, some noises coming out of the Democratic Party that sort of a US-Britain trade deal will be dependent on the Irish question being to the satisfaction of Dublin, which of course has cheered a Biden victory So in summation,
no, but on that point, Case, the Biden crowd and the Democrats are absolutely right.
Yeah,
I mean, it's an absolute travesty what has happened with the Irish border, and the attempt by Johnson to fudge it. So no, I completely support the Biden position on that. Yeah, peace in Ireland is, to be honest, peace in Ireland is worth bloody more than Brexit.
Yeah,
that's just as simple as it is.
Yeah. No, of course, and of course, Biden's perspective on this, as somebody who's quite actively identifies as Irish American and Irish Catholic, is
right.
Is going to be an interesting one to watch. Whether that at all enters into how the special relationship will inevitably be redefined as a result of this.
Yeah. I mean, we'll have to wait and see what kind of final Brexit deal emerges, and what kind of leverage the US would be prepared to use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In summation, there are lots of interesting things to look forward to, or I don't know if "look forward to" is the right phrase, in the next few months and years. Do you expect, if Trump didn't provide much of a push for American studies, do you think Biden might paradoxically do this?
Yeah, he might. That's intriguing. At least he will be more likable. And I think that is one of the, I think it's an emotional thing. I think, the American Studies crowd, we all love the United States. We also hate aspects about it. That's part of the deal. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, you're in American Studies because you want to spend time in America and hang out with Americans because it's fun. And obviously those connections don't change, but the overall sense of what is America, that starts to get undermined, and I think Biden will revive that.
And perhaps I'm to be honest, I'm fairly sympathetic to the student position. Like I'm not sure I would make the choice to consciously spend much more time in the intellectual company of the Trump White House than I would necessarily want to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's true. It's you can come out with all sorts of great historical explanations about where Trump came from, but it's still Trump, and it's still pretty ugly. I mean, seriously, a president who deliberately aims to undermine the very democratic system around them is it's kind of off the scale.
Yeah. No, I can only agree, and it's going to be. I mean, I will say from some of the predictions that were raised before the elections, where if you read reports about sales of ammunition running out at Walmart, and really quite a few quite serious commentators, people whose views I respect, warning of large-scale civil unrest if Biden should win in exactly the way that he has now won, right, by a victory which is, to all extent unambiguous, but which is being actively contested by Trump and by a portion of the Republican Party, that you would then have civil unrest. And that so far, thankfully, has not emerged.
Yeah, but I mean, we all know it's just under the surface, and it will emerge in various ugly ways, I'm sure, if not in the coming week and then in the coming 6 months or whatever.
In any case, we'll be having an ongoing conversation, I think, about where Trump as a person goes, where Trumpism goes, where the social forces that he aligned with go after Trump has left the White House, if he does. Hopefully, if he does leave, he will hopefully leave the White House. But I suppose we'll be watching that very closely, and it may occasion another podcast series at some time in the future. I'll have to discuss that with Dario, but we'll.
Okay, very good. And I don't think we should hold our breath about a Trump presidential library. I think that's something to reflect on. I think Obama already decided that he was not going to do that as well, right? He was not going to have a specific location.
Could it be the Trump Presidential Library, Hotel and Casino at Mar-a-Lago?
It could be. It could be turning the presidential library experience into full-on kind of sordid entertainment. I'm sure if he can find a way to earn some money out of his presidential legacy, he will. Like some kind of Disneyland Epcot White House experience / Graceland.
Florida would be the right place for it, I suppose.
Yeah, I think we should watch out for that. There could be some interesting research to be done.
Well, maybe future historians will indeed be going to the Trump Presidential Library and Casino at Mar-a-Lago.
Yes. Yeah. Let's look out for that case.
Let's look out for that. In the meantime, I just wanted to thank you very much for joining me today for this conversation. And and hopefully we'll be able to have more of these conversations at the RIAS going forward.
Excellent case. Look forward to it. Thanks a lot for very good questions.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop the recording.
Yeah.